Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. We recently hit 1,000 subscribers. I want to say thank you for that right off the bat. And with that being said, let's get into the list. Dread is a 2009 psychological horror film that was distributed by After Dark Films as part of their 8 Films to Die For initiative, also known as After Dark Horror Fest. They did this annually between 2006 and 2010. After Dark Horror Fest was the film festival they put on to showcase these films to drum up some excitement before releasing them on home video. This was basically just a really good marketing strategy since the quality of these films would vary greatly, but I remember every year I was still excited to check out their lineup because there would usually be like 1 or 2 films that was interesting. Dread is based on a Clive Barker story, and it's about this group of college students that are doing a research project on fear. One of them is incredibly enthusiastic about the project, which makes the relationships of the group deteriorate rather quickly because the research becomes less and less ethical. It feels like this movie was financed because of the success of the Saw franchise, but there's actually not a lot of torture in the film, but it is really mean-spirited, so it has that, post-Saw, post-Hostel feel to it. Between the gray and brown color grading, the hairstyles, and the overall nihilism of the film, it definitely feels pretty dated, but there's also a lot of things I really like about it. One of the reasons why I haven't told you more about the plot, except for a basic outline, is that this film is a really slow burn. A lot of disturbing things happen in this movie, but pretty much all of them are in the last 30 minutes. Before that, we see how the group is working on this project, and they're all broken in certain ways, which of course also impacts the way they treat each other. I know I brought up Saw and Hostel, but I don't want to make it seem like this is like extremely gory, because it's not. But I think you have to have some sort of appreciation for those types of films to enjoy this one. It gets incredibly bleak and mean-spirited, which I know some people absolutely hate, and I mention this because this seems to be a film that people either rate really high or really low, but as you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of it. The director of Dread, Anthony de Blasi, would later go on and make our next entry on the list, Last Shift. It came out in 2014 and was one of my favorite movies that year. It's a small-scale indie horror that's set inside a police station that's about to be permanently closed. A rookie cop ends up on guard duty on the last night shift that the station is in use. It's kind of a modern inner-city take on the classic come spend the night in my haunted mansion and win a bunch of money setup, but I guess the only price she wins here is her paycheck? I don't know. I haven't thought through enough, maybe. But you get what I'm trying to say here, right? She has to spend the night in this location. A bunch of spooky shit happens throughout the night. And she just has to hold on until morning. And that's the best part of the movie, because it's legitimately scary. The old decrepit police station really feels more like a haunted house than a place of authority. As the movie progresses, things start to get more and more surreal. Side characters show up, and their interactions go from weird to bizarre really quickly. You can never quite figure out what's real or not. Another thing that keeps me coming back to this film is the mythology behind the threat and how it connects to the main character. I've made this film sound like a haunted house movie, but that's not really what it is. It's a little more dark and sinister than that. Or rather, it kind of starts as a haunted house film and then ends up feeling like a descent into complete madness with hellish imagery. Anthony de Blasi ended up remaking the movie with a bigger budget, and that remake was released last year. It's called Malum, and I don't necessarily think it's bad, but it's just unnecessary. There's nothing about this story that really needed a bigger budget, so Last Shift is actually the superior movie. Malum ended up being less scary because they show more of what's going on, and with this story I definitely felt like less is more. But if you really liked Last Shift, you can check out Malum. It's not a bad time, it's just kind of a strange project. Faking a Murderer is a mockumentary about 2 filmmakers' desperate attempt to break into the true crime genre. The film starts with them looking for investors for their new project, which is an investigative documentary about a weird YouTube channel they found. They claim that this small YouTuber admits to killing someone in one of the videos, and their plan is to interview him. If you haven't figured it out yet, this is a comedy, and it's pretty ridiculous. I laughed a lot during this film. Because it's filmed in a mockumentary style, it has that kind kind of workplace comedy vibe to it, which I always really enjoy. Most of the comedy here comes from the two of them being very incompetent at what they're trying to achieve, but also managing to stumble into some really interesting situations. And the last part of the movie is where it really starts going off the rails, and that's the part that makes me feel okay about including it on this list of horror movies. Because before that, it really just feels like a straight comedy. I thought all the characters here were really endearing, and the way the film satirizes true crime is really clever. I enjoyed watching these two bomb pitch meeting after pitch meeting, but then of course, one of the studios decides to finance the project anyway because they figure true crime is easy money. I'm excited to see what the people behind this movie does next, because this was really special. Calibre was released on Netflix in 2018, and like most movies on Netflix, it came and went rather quickly. It's about two friends who are on a hunting trip in the Scottish countryside. After a devastating accident, they do their best to leave quietly, but that's of course not possible, as they run into troubles with the locals. There are very few good characters in this, which makes the film a pretty bleak experience, but the cat and mouse game that's at the core of the film is really great. Essentially, this is a film where the characters just keep making poor decisions out of cowardice and anger. Pretty much everyone on both sides of the conflict that arises only make things worse by making these really brash decisions. But since the characters are fleshed out, you understand why they are making these bad decisions. They are like self-destructive train wrecks that you can't help but look away from. But then the movie also has some Wicker Man vibes, as the locals in this town are not very friendly to visitors even before the accident happens. What I'm trying to say is that even though the movie has kind of a familiar setup, it actually goes in a lot of interesting directions. And the true horror of the situation kind of shifts depending on what perspective you're looking at it from. The ending of this film has not left my brain since the first time I saw it. You definitely have to be in the mood for something bleak to enjoy this one, but I think it's one of the best original Netflix horror movies. Bedevilled is a 2010 South Korean horror revenge film. Those films usually fall more into the category of action or thrillers, but this is a straight-up horror film with some really nasty gore. I've seen this be compared to I Spit on Your Grave, but I think that actually does Bedevilled a disservice. I think this is a lot smarter than your standard exploitation film, even though it certainly has some of that DNA. It's about these two women that were childhood friends, and over time they've drifted apart from each other. One of them moved out of the rural community they grew up in, while the other one stayed behind. When the movie opens, Haewon, the one who lives in Seoul, decides to visit the village where she comes from, and that's when she reconnects with her old friend, Buknam. And even though this movie opens from Haewon's perspective, the story is way more focused on Buknam. Seeing her struggle in the first half of this film is really difficult. She gets abused by most people in the community in one way or another. The community is also located on an island, which further symbolizes her isolation. Buknam thinks Haewon's visit is the beginning of a new chapter for her, but it instead leads to a blood-soaked killing spree. This is definitely not a film for the faint of heart, but I think there's something very cathartic about movies like this. And then when you add in the very strained friendship of these two women, it actually makes it a really heartfelt story. There's a lot of disturbing content in this film, but it all has a purpose, and it manages to pull on your heartstrings even though it is an insanely bloody movie. The Town That Dreaded Sundown from 2014 often gets referred to as a remake of the 1976 original, but this is way more of a meta sequel, but it's not like comedic like other meta horror movies are. It takes itself pretty seriously. In this film, the original The Town That Dreaded Sundown exists as a movie that the characters are all very well aware of. And as far as my thoughts on the original movie, it's very unsettling, but it's kind of a weird one since it's based on a real case of an uncaught serial killer from the 40s, but they also take some huge liberties with that story. The remake plays with all of this as a new series of killings begin in Texarkana. The characters all talk talk about the real case and what was made up for the 1976 film as they unravel the new mystery. This film has a great sense of style to it, with some sequences feeling very Giallo inspired. I could also feel a fair bit of influence taken from David Fincher's Zodiac, especially in the scenes where the killer talks to his victims. Since the film has a bit of that true crime element to it, there is a bit of sleaziness to it here that stays true to the original. But it's kind of unexpected seeing that this is a Blumhouse movie. But the biggest positive I have to say about this film is how stylish it is. I think the kill sequences in particular are great. Silent Night is another remake of a classic slasher film, but I actually didn't see this one up until last year, and I was very positively surprised by it. It's very loosely based on the 1984 film Silent Night, Deadly Night, but except for a few callbacks, this is an original story, with the main connecting thing being that both of the films have a slasher villain dressed as Santa Claus. This is definitely the sleaziest movie I've talked about so far on these lists. It's filled with gratuitous violence and nudity, but that's kind of what you want from a film like this. Jamie King stars as a police officer in a small town who has to work on Christmas. The police chief is played by Malcolm McDowell, who chews the scenery just about as much as you expect him to. Someone dressed as Santa Claus begins picking off people in the town, and it's up to the police to stop them. If you watched Thanksgiving from last year and liked that one, I think this is like a way more mean-spirited version of that movie, but set on Christmas. It's honestly a pretty ridiculous movie and was clearly made on a lower budget, but I'm a huge fan of slashers like this. I mean, there's a killer dressed as Santa Claus with a flamethrower in this movie. What's not to love? It can look pretty cheap at times, but as far as modern slashers go, I think this is very underrated. I've barely heard anyone talk about it. Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse is directed by Christopher Landon, who would later go on to direct the Happy Death Day movies and Freaky. Like those films, this is a horror comedy, but it's a bit of a different breed than his other stuff. This one has a bit of a raunchy high school comedy vibe to it, not unlike Superbad. Out of all of Landon's movies, I think this is the one I enjoyed the most, but that's maybe just because this is my type of really immature humor. It's about these three high school boys that are still in the Boy Scouts because one of them takes it super seriously, and the other two are just kind of going along with it. On the night that there's supposed to be this big party, a zombie outbreak occurs, and the three boys have to use their survival skills to, well, survive. But they also meet a lot of other funny characters along the way. I compared this film to Superbad for a reason. It's very over the top and gory, but because you have these themes of, these friends that are kind of drifting apart with age, relationships changing, and so on, the core of this movie actually has a lot of heart. The boys are, of course, teenagers, so they make a lot of immature jokes, but they're not necessarily awful to each other, so you can really feel their friendship. They don't make these types of raunchy comedies anymore, so this is one I go back to every once in a while. As the Gods Will is the second Takashi Miike film to get a spot on these lists. At the time, I remember this being pitched as a fantastical version of Battle Royale, but nowadays it's probably more comparable to Squid Games. The plot here is pretty absurd, so bear with me for a little bit. It's set in high school, so that's where the Battle Royale comparison comes in, and the students of this high school are forced to play childhood games by a fantastical being of sorts. I can't quite describe it. I'll just put an image on screen of what this thing looks like. It's all very dreamlike. The students are unable to leave the school as soon as this thing shows up, and the further the movie you get, the more ethereal it all feels. Like this is some ancient god that has come down to this one specific Japanese high school. A lot of the special effects and CGI look very out of this world. It's not the type of CGI that's made to look like it belongs in the real world. It's supposed to be kind of jarring, and in that way I think the visual style really works. The movie is also absurdly violent. When people fail these games, they just explode into a gooey mess. It's honestly pretty unhinged, and I think that's why I have such an admiration for the film. Definitely watch this one if you're in the mood for something wild. I saved Assassination Nation for last because this one is a doozy. It's a mix-up of different genres and ideas that seems to be really divisive. This is another one, where people seem to rate it either really highly or really low. It's directed by Sam Levinson, who would later go on to be the showrunner for HBO's Euphoria and The Idol. He's one of those filmmakers that people have really turned on over the years, and I understand why. I will still stand by this movie, though. This is an exploitation film at heart. It's about a group of 4 high school girls that find themselves hunted down by a group of angry vigilantes after the entire town's personal information gets leaked online. Private messages, emails, and photographs are included, so there's a bunch of angry people in this town feeling like their lives have been ruined now that all their secrets are out there, and it's all getting pinned on these 4 girls. Everyone in this town absolutely lose their shit, and it probably will remind you a bit of The Purge. It has some of that action horror vibe that those movies have, but it takes a while to get to that point, and that's probably my biggest criticism of the film. I always appreciate when a movie takes its time, but the writing here really isn't very good. The dialogue in particular is kind of rough. I think it's supposed to be edgy, but it just comes across as kind of absurd. Also, there's this way that Sam Levinson sexualizes his teenage characters. It's just really off-putting to me, but I think that criticism has more to do with his entire career than just this movie. It does, however, undermine the feminist message this movie tries to have. So, I guess I'm sounding pretty negative here. Why am I still recommending it, right? Well, the movie gets by on vibes alone for me. This film looks and sounds incredible. There's a home invasion scene that I think is one of the best of all time. There's another scene where a character locks herself into a bathroom, and the bathroom is like covered in blood, so she's frantically trying to find a weapon to defend herself while someone is, banging on the door, and she's like slipping around on this blood and gets covered in red, and it's really well directed. It's really intense. This is a movie that has like good horror moments like that, but then it also showcases a very pop aesthetic, and I'm not just saying that because it features music from Charli XCX, although that certainly helps. Parts of the movie really feels like a music video, which is something I would probably say to criticize a lesser film, but here it's high praise. It's one of those movies where I couldn't take my eyes off the screen for even a second, because at that point I would probably miss like 3 cool shots. And that's all the films I had today. I have a quick announcement. Now that we hit 1,000 subscribers, I am going to expand this series, or rather, I'm going to start a new series, but expand the channel, rather, to talk about classic films as well. And those videos will probably be titled like Underrated, Classic, Horror, and Exploitation Films, because I want to talk about exploitation films as well. There's a lot of stuff from like the 60s, 70s, especially, that's like not strictly horror, but will very much appeal to horror audiences, and there's so much exploitation and really good stuff like that I want to get into. I'm having a lot of fun rewatching these movies with like commentary tracks to be able to give a little bit more background on some of them. Obviously the descriptions are still going to be like, I'm going to have this brief format that I'm doing right now, but I want to delve in and do some more research on these specific classic films that I want to talk about. Probably not going to be as many episodes of that show as this one, because I watch a lot of modern stuff, but I do like classic films as well, and would like to expand and talk about that as well with this format that people seem to be enjoying. As I said, 1,000 subscribers, amazing. I'm just so appreciative of every single one of you. Thank you so much for watching. Tell me suggestions in the comments what films I should include in the future, and yeah, I hope you all are well, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Okay, bye.